and thank you for joining us at the Swell Summit. Our next Swell speaker is Dr. Jamil Zaki. Dr. Zaki is an associate professor of psychology at Stanford University. His research spans a number of domains, including social influence, pro-social behavior, and especially empathy. He has pioneered a new perspective on empathy as a learnable skill, and much of his work focuses on training individuals, groups, and organizations to empathize more effectively. Dr. Zaki received his BA in Cognitive Neuroscience from Boston University and his PhD in Psychology from Columbia University. In 2019, he was awarded the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, which is the US government's highest honor for researchers at his career stage. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Zaki is active in outreach and public communication in science. Without any further ado, here's Dr. Jamil Zaki speaking about building empathy in a fractured world.
Thanks everyone for being here. Here, of course, being wherever you are during this unprecedented, strange, and difficult time. So let me just begin by saying that wherever you are and whoever you're with, I hope that you're safe and healthy and well. I'm thrilled to chat with you all about some of my work thinking and writing on empathy, and in particular, how we might build empathy. I do think that these ideas are potentially even more crucial now during this difficult time that we're all going through together than usual. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of COVID-19 for empathy towards the end of the talk. Okay, so I want to start by going all the way back to the beginning, like maybe 50 or 100,000 years ago, to a time when people really weren't that impressive. At that moment, we were just medium-sized mammals, not particularly fast or strong. We couldn't fly. We weren't even the only smart species on the planet. At that time, we shared the Earth with at least 5 other large-brained human species. And yet there were some things that set us apart. Most of all, each other. Far more than any other animal on the planet, sapiens collaborated and cared for one another. And that made all the difference. Because even if as individuals we were unassuming, as a collective, we were breathtaking. We could do things no other animal could ever dream of. It was by working together that we took over the world. But what allows us to work so well together? Well, there's a few reasons for this, maybe many, but one that psychologists and neuroscientists have been fascinated with for the better part of a century is the weird and wonderful fact that even though people are physically separate from each other, psychologically we overlap. And that sense of self-other overlap can be so intense that sometimes when we see something occur to somebody else, it actually feels like it's happening to us instead. In case you haven't had this experience recently and you're not scared of heights, here's a guy walking across the Grand Canyon. Now, the funny thing is that although I can't see all of you, I assume that you are sitting or standing on relatively solid ground. So am I. The Bay Area the relatively is operative. But if you're anything like me, just looking at this video, you might feel your palms start to sweat. You might feel a little bit nervous, like it were you, not him, on the wire. That experience is a primitive form of empathy, our emotional and psychological entanglements with each other. Empathy is a simple word for a complex idea. And in fact, researchers like me think of empathy actually as an umbrella term that describes multiple ways that we connect with each other's emotions. So I'll try to explain this using an example. Let's say that you're having lunch with a friend and he gets a phone call. You don't know who's on the other side of the line or what they're saying, but you can tell it's not good because your friend begins to cry. Well, as you see him break down, a few things might happen in you. First, you might feel bad yourself, vicariously sharing his feelings, which we would call emotional empathy. You might also try to understand what he's feeling and why, which we would call cognitive empathy. And third, at least if you're a decent pal, you probably care about your friend and wish for him to feel better. And you might even try to figure out how you could help. That's what we often call empathic concern or compassion. You might think that these three pieces are just different sides of the same coin, but it turns out they split apart in really interesting ways. So for instance, they're only moderately correlated across the population. What does that mean? It means that if you're, for instance, really tend to intensely share other people's emotions, that actually doesn't tell me very much about whether you'll be good at understanding their emotions as well. These pieces of empathy are also affected in different conditions. People with autism spectrum disorders sometimes struggle to understand what others are feeling, but they're perfectly able to share and care about other people's emotions. Whereas people with psychopathy often have the opposite profile. So these pieces of empathy are related, but can be separated. And nonetheless, together, they make up the full range of human empathy. You can think about empathy as an individual quality, how much of it you or someone you know has. We can also think about empathy like in your town or our country or the Stanford diaspora as the psychological or human equivalent of a natural resource. And it is a precious one. Decades of evidence now demonstrate countless ways that empathy benefits like everyone involved, including ourselves. We often think of empathy as something we do for others, but when individuals feel empathy, they benefit as well. For instance, they report being happier, they report less depression and stress, they have an easier time forming and keeping important relationships, and they're more likely to succeed professionally. Empathy's benefits, of course, bubble outward. Patients of empathic doctors more satisfied with their care. Employees of empathic managers are less likely to call in sick with stress-related illnesses. And maybe unsurprisingly, spouses of empathic partners tend to report being happier in their marriages. But maybe the most important and most crucial role of empathy is actually in helping us stitch together broader communities, not just between us and the people we know and love, but even towards strangers. So for instance, people who tend to feel lots of empathy also tend to help strangers, for instance, by volunteering and donating to charity. And empathy also makes it less likely that we see strangers who are different from us through the lens of stereotyping, prejudice, and bias. So this is great. We've got on our side empathy, this ancient instinctive engine for kindness and collaboration and cooperation. And we, the most empathic animal on the planet, took the place over. So we must be just living in an empathic utopia, all sitting in a global circle together, holding hands and sing. Well, no, that's not, of course, the world that we live in. Empathy is hard. And I would argue that it's getting harder. To understand why, we can revisit our Paleolithic pals here and think about the social world in which empathy evolved, and maybe the world that it's built for. Well, at that time, human beings existed in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers. What that means is that if you ran into somebody else, probably a few things were true. You were likely familiar to each other, maybe even related. You were visible to each other. We could hear pain and pleasure in each other's voice, see it on each other's faces. And we were accountable. In small communities, people can tally other people's history of kindness or indifference, and karma is like real and concrete. I think of these ingredients of social life, familiarity, visibility, and accountability, as empathy's primordial soup, sort of a cocktail that together make it easy and natural for us to connect with and care about one another. But I would also argue that these ingredients of social life have rapidly disappeared, especially in the last century or so. Humanity has, with incredible speed, moved into large cities and started living alone, meaning that in a real way, we see more people than ever, but we know fewer of them. Rituals that used to bring us into regular contact, everything from bowling leagues to church going, have given way to solitary pursuits often carried out online. Online in settings where we often are anonymous to each other. We don't have the cues that spark our empathy, and we don't have accountability towards others. and online in settings where often the first thing that we learn about someone is something that we fear or despise, where people become enemies before they have a chance to be people. This type of environment is not necessarily great soil for social connection. And along with these huge structural changes, we've seen incredible increases in loneliness, cynicism, anxiety, and decreases in empathy. One could, in fact, argue that if you want to build a system to break human empathy, you could scarcely do better than we have. And I'm going to show you some evidence that it has broken. So here's the most common way that psychologists measure empathy. It's just a self-report scale. It's a series of statements, and you're told to say how well each statement describes you, from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely. So I'll give you a couple of them, and you can think about them on your own. So here's one. I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. You can think about how well that describes you. Here's another. I try and look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision, right? Again, you can think about how well that describes you. So your answer to those statements plus 26 others would give you an empathy index or score somewhere between 1 and 5. Hopefully that makes sense. This test was developed in the 1970s, and since then, hundreds of thousands of people have taken it. And recently, psychologists decided to aggregate this information, and the news was not great. Here I'll show you the average American's score on this test in 1979. 4 out of 5, not terrible, a solid B. Here it is again in 2009, much closer to a 3 out of 5. It's a big drop. To put it in perspective, the average American in 2009, by their own self-report, was less empathic than 75% of Americans just 30 years before. So maybe this study is shocking to you. Or maybe it's the opposite of shocking. Maybe you didn't need a study to tell you that it's become harder for people to connect with each other. I know it's been a very interesting experience for me, right? My entire scientific career, I've spent documenting, in many cases, the really powerful benefits that empathy gives to us and the people around us. But as a person, I've noticed all of these trends, from political polarization to certain aspects of life online, that seem to be pulling us apart instead of bringing us together. It's almost like the culture that we've built is poorly calibrated with the instincts for togetherness and connection that allowed us to build it in the first place. I've felt sometimes like being a psychologist studying empathy these days feels like being a climate scientist studying the polar ice. We document the benefits of something just as it disappears all around us, which is bleak, I know, and we're only 15 minutes in. But that's good, actually, because I'm hoping that we can use the rest of our time to think hard about this problem and what we can do about it. And in particular, I want to spend the rest of our time on a simple question. Does it have to be this way? Do we have to accept that as we continue to become more urban, more technologically mediated, which we will, that we are also doomed to become more callous, less connected, even crueler? Or can we push back? Is there anything that we can do to try to reclaim our common humanity and rebuild our empathy? I'll be sharing some thoughts for the rest of the talk, but please feel free to share your own in the chat as well if you like. So from my perspective, the answer to this question, can we rebuild our empathy, boils down to the answer to an even simpler question. Is empathy something that we can control at all? And I would say that standard wisdom from my own fields of psychology and neuroscience has been, not really. We can't control our empathy because it's a trait. Maybe this is an intuition that you've had in the past. I don't know, try it out. Think about the most empathic person you've ever met or known, and the least empathic person you've ever known. Now, maybe you think that those two people were just born that way, that their level of empathy or lack thereof was just kind of hardwired into their genes and coded into their brains. If you believe that, well, then maybe you also believe that, let's say that there's a line between the most and least empathic person, that each of us might have some level of empathy. And just like our adult height or the color of our eyes, we're mostly stuck there for life. right? We can't change. That's just sort of where we are. Now, if you are high in empathy, this is great news for you. It means you are bound to benefit from empathy's positive qualities, and the people around you are as well. But if you struggle to connect with people, this is terrible news, because it means that no matter what you do or how hard you try, you can't get better at it. It's even worse news for us as a group, because it means that if the modern world is putting barriers up that make empathy harder, there's nothing we can do to overcome those barriers either. This is a fatalistic view of empathy. Thankfully, it's also wrong. I want to spend the rest of our time together today telling you about a new view of human empathy in science that I and many other people have been working on. But I want to start by telling you that for me, it's actually not that new at all. In fact, this is a view that defined a lot of my childhood. It turns out that in the early 1970s, Washington State University in Pullman offered graduate scholarships to students from some of the world's poorest nations. And my mom got the scholarship from Peru, and my dad did not get a scholarship, not as good a student as my mom, but came to Washington State anyways from Pakistan. So they traveled from these two massive cities of Lima and Lahore, again, to this tiny little town of Pullman, where they fell in love. It turns out that for them, it was not meant to be. When I think about my parents, even now, I think that one of the big things that they had in common was their sense of foreignness in the US. I think they were both pretty uncomfortable here when they got here, and that they found comfort in each other. But as they acclimated to their new country, I mean, now they've been here for 50 years almost, I think they realized how little they had in common, which as their only child is extremely little. I mean, these people are just very different from each other. So I spent a lot of my childhood sort of watching them get divorced, right? They started when I was 8 and didn't finish until I was 12, and it was not one of the amicable kinds. And so I spent a lot of time sort of shuttling back and forth between their houses during that process. And to me, it often felt like I was going between parallel universes. I'm sure anyone here who's a child of divorce maybe can sympathize with this, but I felt like when I was with my mom, I had to basically tune myself to her emotional frequencies, figure out what mattered to her, and make that matter to me as well. But when I got to my dad's house, those same rules stopped applying, and I had to recalibrate, which is hard emotional labor for like an 8-year-old, right? And I think that for a while, the three of us thought that I would basically have to pick one parent and kind of give up on the other. But I knew that for all of our sake, I had to keep trying. And so I did. And eventually it got easier. I learned to tune myself more easily to their different emotional frequencies, and eventually managed to keep my connection to each of my parents really strong, even as their connection to each other disintegrated. I would say that empathy basically saved my family and my childhood, but not because it came naturally. I think of my parents' divorce as an empathy gym that forced me to work at care and understanding, really almost as a survival skill. And, you know, I think that that experience and the benefits that it brought to me is a big reason why I study what I do in the first place. In the many years since then, I've documented lots of evidence that runs counter to standard wisdom, but actually jibes with my own childhood experience. It turns out that empathy is not just a trait. Yes, our genes do matter, but so do our experiences. And empathy can usefully be viewed really as something like a skill, because some experiences can cause it to atrophy, but other experiences can cause our empathy to grow and broaden and intensify. And critically, that means that the choices and habits and practices that we make and cultivate can allow us to build our empathy on purpose, the same way you'd work out a muscle. So if my parents' divorce was an empathy gym for me, I now see my job as building empathy gyms for other people. My colleagues and I try to set up situations where people can practice caring and understanding and get better at it if they want to. I want to share with you just a few of the insights that we've gotten along the way. The first one is that if you want to cross boundaries between us and them, you can begin by returning to you and I. One of the most painful and difficult things about division in our culture, as I see it, is that it stops us from being curious about who's on the other side, whether it's a generational divide, an ideological one, a racial or ethnic one. We often start to reduce people to just one part of their identity and stop wondering really who they are. The good news is that that type of prejudice or dehumanization is really hard to do up close because people are complicated and no one can be reduced to just one part of their identity. So it turns out that when we get to know individuals who are different from us and really think about their experiences as individual people, we don't just build empathy for them, we actually build empathy for the whole group to which they belong. Recently, my colleagues at Stanford's Virtual Reality Lab and I tried a high-tech version of this type of empathy building. We used a VR simulation to help people build empathy for individuals from a group that often doesn't receive a lot of empathy, homeless people in the Bay Area. So we created a simulation that had a number of different scenes in it that mimicked what it might be like to become homeless. So here in the first one, someone has been evicted from their apartment and is trying to sell their furniture to make ends meet. They're then living in their car, which is impounded. And finally, they've taken to a local bus line for shelter in the last scene. And I should say that this was based on interviews with homeless individuals in the Bay Area. This was a short simulation, just about 15 minutes, but we found that it had long-lasting impact. So people who went through this VR simulation as compared to folks in a control group actually reported even 1 month later less tendency to dehumanize homeless individuals and more support for affordable housing policies in the Bay Area, which, as many of you know, is a crucial issue these days especially. So again, the punchline here is that when we focus on particular individuals, you and I, instead of reducing people to us and them mentality, we can often build our empathy. We did that using VR, but the good news is you don't need like an Oculus Rift to understand the experiences of people who are different from you. It turns out that reading novels whose protagonists come from different groups builds our empathy for real people from those groups. But the best way to get to know an individual who's different from you is to get to know an individual who's different from us. I feel like, they're all around, but sometimes it can feel challenging, especially these days in this hyper-polarized age, to try and really make a meaningful connection to someone we disagree with or someone we don't identify with. But it turns out that when we take the effort to do that, we often broaden our social antenna in ways that can be really powerful. So that was principle number one. The second principle that I want to share with you is that caring is contagious. In a good type of contagion for a change. All sorts of behaviors are contagious because human beings are a herd species. We tend to do and think and feel and say what people around us do. And that can be tragic when negative behaviors spread through our social networks. But it can also be positive. In my own research, I found that when people believe that others around them are empathic and generous, they themselves are more likely to act in caring ways as well. Recently, my colleagues and I decided to see if we could leverage the power of conformity to build kinder cultures among the most conformist people on the planet. Not a knock on them, but it's true. 7th graders. They really are, by age, the most conformist group of people we have. And so we worked in 4 Bay Area middle schools with about 850 students in 7th grade. And about 200 of these, we put in a condition that we call an empathic norms condition, which simply means that we tried to convince these students that empathy was popular among their peers. I'm going to try to play you a short video, a clip from a video that we showed them, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Specifically, 7th graders tend to like empathy more, meaning that they want to be empathic. They also value empathy in others, meaning that they like it when other people are empathic and want to be friends with empathic people. Finally, they expect empathy from others, meaning that in 7th grade, most people are empathic. And now more than ever, you and your 7th grade peers are better able to share and understand each other's emotions.
Okay, so this again was meant to convince students in that condition that empathy was popular among their peers. After that, we had students describe why they valued empathy, and then we collated all their responses. Why? Well, so that when they came back, we could show them basically a brochure of all of their friends and classmates saying why they valued empathy. In essence, we were trying to alert students to a real social norm all around them, how popular empathy was among their peers. We then asked them to tell us how people in their grade felt about empathy, and they took to this task really well. So here's one sample response. People in my grade feel very strongly about empathy. In 7th grade, it's really important to value empathy, and I can see that many people in my grade value it a lot. Smiley face emoji, which I take to be one of the most enthusiastic things a 7th grader can give, at least to me. So students in this condition, after learning how popular empathy was, at least telling us that they value it. Did they also act in empathic ways? Well, to test that, we returned to these schools 1 to 2 months later, and we asked students to nominate people in their class who were nice, who did favors or helped other kids, and who seemed caring. And what we found is that students in our empathic norm condition, compared to students in control conditions, told us that they were more motivated to empathize. And that in turn predicted that a month later, their classmates reported them as acting in kind ways. Mind you, not that they told us that they acted kindly, that other people told us that they acted kindly, which we take to be even a more convincing measure. So to me, this is a really hopeful study. I also think it's one that has implications that go far beyond school settings. I think in our culture, sometimes the loudest voices are not the kindest. So think about these students. Before our study, they might have been paying attention to a schoolyard bully. Or you can think about extreme pundits on cable news, or your favorite loud, mean person on Twitter. These people might not represent us, but it's easy, they take up so much airtime that it's easy to think that they do, and to feel like if we want to fit in, we have to fall in line and act the way that they do.